Professor Emmanuel, lead of the Workforce Race Equality Standard, NHS England and NHS Improvement, and interim joint director of Equality, Diverse Inclusion for NHS EDI. Anton is professor and consultant neurogastroenterologist, medical director of publishing at the Royal College of Physicians, and editor-in-chief at Clinical Medicine and Commentary. In his lead role for Workforce Race Equality Standard, he is really shifting and moving the focus of RES towards embedding local accountability with organizations for their own data. And a key component is to develop Workforce Race Equality Standard metrics, which reflect the individual experience of trust of staff within NHS organizations and systems to implement evidence-based actions. And this is the longer term work, is to develop the NHS first race equity strategy. So absolutely delighted to quickly hand over to Professor Emmanuel who will discuss building leadership for inclusion.
Hi there. Thank you so much, and say apologies for having difficulties joining. I seem to be fated, but thank you for persevering with me. And I hope this is on point and of some use. And I offer it with humility, because I'm not somebody who's ever seen myself in a leadership role. I just happen to be a clinician and a researcher who accidentally stepped into NHS England and finds myself here, but I'm incredibly invested in the workforce. So for me, the only reason for having anything to do with the national team is that actually there's a focus on what the product is, and the product is essentially to do things for the workforce rather than to be navel-gazy, which is often the temptation. I'm also aware I'm standing in for a much better speaker in this space, who's my friend and colleague Tracy, who unfortunately is unwell, but I will do my best to do her work justice and try and present this from my perspective, essentially that of a clinician with an interest in how leadership actually has delivery, and with a focus on the RES, because that's what I'm most closely connected to. So fundamentally, and again, I'm aware that I'm speaking to a group of expert colleagues here, so my insights are those of an academic person. So in other words, what you guys have is the lived experience of doing this. What I have is the experience of being a clinician in this space. And what I'm trying to present is an interface between what the research says as I read it, moving away from my clinical research into this kind of area of organizational research. And essentially, to have an inclusive leadership, it requires three fundamental things, of which probably the most important driving first principle is that there's this philosophy that all staff, irrespective of whichever characteristics they do or don't have, is treated equally. Now, I say I won't be talking exclusively about race, but obviously the RES part of it that I do will focus on some of the stuff from there. But it's essentially about all protected characteristics having equal importance and salience. Then the next thing that the leadership thing needs to do is, apart from having that philosophy of doing that, is to have that sense that the idea that all staff belong in their organization is fundamental to that. And of course, that's enshrine the people plan type stuff. But that sense of increasing belonging, which we know a lot of people don't get from their workplace. And then thirdly, and importantly, the idea that giving resource to this, it isn't just telling people to be resilient and look after themselves. We've done our bit and treated you equally. Now go along and find your own resource. Part of the deal of being a leader is to provide the resource and space that allows people to do their best. And as Cheryl was saying earlier on, bringing yourself to work involves having the resource to allow you to do that. Because if you don't, you expect it to just be another drone in the system, just filling your part, then you don't actually bring your whole self. The risks in doing this, however, if you don't do this sincerely, and one of the things that really ticks me off when I talk to CEOs and colleagues around the country, is when they talk about, oh, we must change culture. Because the problem with this thing about changing culture is it assumes that we are stupid as workforce people, that we think that, oh, if I see an extra BME person here, or an extra person with a disability there, or an extra line in the statement on your website, that I'm going to suddenly fall for it and think, oh, well, this is great. And there is a risk of tokenism with all this stuff. We all saw what happened around Black Lives Matter last year. Everyone rushed to put out a black square around their Twitter or say something in their trust website, you know, it needs to have something more than tokenism. The illustration on the side is lifted from a magazine, but tells you essentially where power still lies. You can stick somebody in here, you can have an extra award at one particular ceremony, but it isn't going to actually fundamentally change that. And this notion that you can change culture by acting in a token fashion is not going to wash, not least because it also makes the person who's been put into that token position feel rather uncomfortable and abused and taken advantage of. So we need to be respectful to the wider workforce and to the individual in that. I grew up in French West Africa, where my parents is from, and came to this country late. And I think I use this this image of France quite deliberately because I'm certainly aware, having also spent some time in France in my postgraduate life, that there is a sense that in France you have to assimilate. You have to, if you want to become a French person, whatever your color or religion or background, you have to belong to the Republic. And that is also not what we're after here. It's a different thing to tokenism, the idea that you have to leave yourself behind and become part of the greater body of a nation in terms of France, but also certain places. Back to my thing about not liking the word culture as its own thing. People say, oh, our culture here in this hospital is to do this, implying that if you aren't in that culture, then you're out. It implies when you come to a workforce thing, so, oh, you didn't quite fit. Fit what? Says who? Okay, so we have to do things based on values rather than this sense of fit. And one of my problems with assimilation is that this is the risk here. And actually what you do is you then thin out the diversity of experience of the person in front of you, and you just have, again, this idea that you just have an identity which is in my eyes rather than your eyes. And that really begins this whole issue, which is fairly fundamental to me, about social identity. One's social identity, I think, has these four extremely important points, which I'd like to just draw out, if I may. And this is, as a leader, one has to recognize this, that a staff member's identity, each of our own identities, is dynamic. It isn't something which is immutable. Okay, yes, certain things are immutable, like your age or your race, but lots of things are not. You know, we've learned that gender is not immutable. Your sexuality, your orientation, your disability status are not. These are dynamic. They don't just get fixed at one point. Equally, there's an intersectional thing. We all have multiple identities that we have. That's a thing to embrace. We're not just purely male or purely BME or whatever. That these identities are determined by society, the whole race gender thing, and certain determinants are much more flagged and easier to discuss than others. And related to that point is the one about salience, which is that certain social identities are given greater prominence, and that changes with time. So at the moment, you know, everything around race, you probably saw stuff in the Sunday Telegraph and all this saying, oh, the NHS is full of woke people. Of course, that's the importance of it. They don't really care about that. They care about the fact that we're having to pay a tiny bit more tax, and so we want to try and criticize the NHS on that grounds and make it sound as if it's a kind of a last outpost of what they call wokery, whatever the hell that is. And so the salience of things changes with time. So let's think about this idea of assimilation as being something which we need to be careful around. And of course, the other part of the risk of all of this is that if we don't do it right, if we aren't inclusive, we dehumanize things. Again, to focus on the media, this term relation, I'm a migrant, I'm an immigrant. Okay, I didn't come here out of it's good fortune. I was acceptable in the 70s at a time when this country was open to the idea of immigration in the way that it isn't now. They're now described in a dehumanizing context. That isn't that extreme. When the stories we hear in the res as we try and make our data more human and take it away from just graphs and numbers into stories of people, which we will be bringing out in future reports, you hear these horrible things, people being compared to or made to feel like animals or inanimate objects or pieces in a puzzle, rather than part of something which embraces their humanity in all its dimensions. And of course, that whole notion is that we need to think about the fact that we need to have some sort of empathy for the person in front of us. And if you don't have that empathy, it's easier to make them the other. And that is one of the fundamental issues here, is how we take this thing about a sympathetic tap on the back to actually being truly empathic about somebody by understanding their whole identity. I'm slightly obsessed by The Wire. It's about the only thing I've ever watched on TV in the last 10 years. And I talked about product earlier on, and I don't believe one of the problems in NHSE as a central team is that we don't focus on our product. Product in the drugs industry matters. Product in terms of what we do in HSE matters, and too often I feel like we focus inwardly. And one of the things I strongly believe is that we need to go out, and one of our products is about increasing the workforce, increasing their capacity to work, increasing leadership, understanding of this, which is why I'm delighted to share this. And you will know that maybe you don't know, Michael K. Williams was one of the actors, portrayed an iconic figure, and died by suicide last week. And I bring this up here because I think often the point about product and bravery as a leader is this thing about speaking up. And one of the things this quote here was about by Wendell Pierce on the right-hand side there about Michael Williams, was this thing around it takes bravery and courage to be fearful of something and do it. In this case, acting, but in the case of each of us, we've all seen things which have made us feel bad, but we've walked on by. We've all heard about the experience of somebody's applied for a job that they're eminently suited for, and somebody less suited without that particular characteristic of the job, and what have we done about that? And it takes a huge amount of personal self-belief and reliance to do that. And I think one of the things about building inclusive leadership is to give people that opportunity and space to do that. And I think as NHS England, that's one of the things we can do, is to give people the, you know, we can't do the doing. That's what you guys do. But what we can do is try and help reduce that burden of fear. And that in part presents by presenting data. So one of the things that's fundamental for me in terms of the things that are required is to recognize, if you are truly going to be a leader, is to recognize where your blind spots are, where your areas of weakness are. In terms of the RARES, I'm going to present some stuff on here, but we're doing exactly the same with the disability standard of RARES as well. But I'm going to present the RARES stuff here to you. We can accumulate our indices and we can generate more interesting metrics than just the simple line indicators you're used to. I don't want to go through detail of that in this conversation, but I just want to try and illustrate how we're using this data. So putting together the various things around representation and around people's subjective feeling of how much they feel they get given an equal crack of the whip in their organization, we can get some blended metrics. And just to put it into context, the last column of numbers, I had to redact the names from this data set, obviously, shows the organizations in a kind of a league table where the average score for an organization would be 333, the very best would be 6, the very worst would be 666. And what you can see is that these organizations are scoring almost as high as they could score. And what that tells you is these guys there's some blind spot here. There's something that we can try and work on. And at the other end of the spectrum, at the very top end of this distribution, as I said, the average would be 333. Here are organizations which are scoring, as close to perfect as possible almost in this. And so how do we learn from the exemplars? How do we recognize people's blind spots, and how do we feed that data back? If you really want to have leadership accountability, we need to be able to embrace where our problems are and then do something about it. That means identifying and being open to the fact that we have problems in certain domains and learning from what is done best. And that is part of this whole leadership cycle, I think, to be able to do that. So to have the courage from the earlier slide, but then to be able to identify stuff. But stuff is more than data and numbers. So we're incredibly invested, as I alluded to earlier on, in the idea that actually you have to personalize the data. You've probably come across this kind of repulsive story, and it is one of literally scores, I'm ashamed to say, that come across our way and galvanize us to keep doing this work. This is an experience of a British nurse of Nigerian heritage who applied for a job, and the recruiting person inadvertently for her sent back a message, obviously a complicit message to a friend, which is accidentally a reply all, which says, as you can see there, another one but Nigerian, X, the kind of casual complicity of an X there tells you something about the culture, in inverted commas, of that place. And so we need to understand that this isn't just a single quantum of data. There's something else about what this experience of this place is. And that is the kind of remorselessness that we will pursue if we can, if you are sincere about leadership in this space, to make these individual experiences not be, oh, well, we can't really get involved with this. We are literally in weekly contact with this organization to find out the outcome of their investigation, which has been going on for 6.5 months now, but we won't relent. That's part of the leadership agenda on this, to humanize these stories and then pursue them. And the whole purpose of this thing is to illustrate, again, now these RES principles I don't want to bang on about too much, but the idea that data, in whatever form, qualitative as in that previous slide, or quantitative, is to be used in a bite-sized way, rather than just being saying, oh, well, we have a big problem with this, or it's a societal problem, we can't get into this. Use your data to identify where your blind spots are, identify how to then work on those blind spots, what are the resources that you need, one needs to do this, implement those, try and get some feedback about what went well or what didn't go well with the implementation, and then recycle that data and just keep going around this in a whack-a-mole kind of way. And ultimately leadership around this idea that you can take action in a bite-sized way, and that's how you change culture, not by saying you're going to change culture and doing something as a flagship, actually doing it in a sustained way. That's how your workforce then actually believe the sincerity of what you're saying. As I said, I'm an African by background, and I show this slide to make that point about networks. How is it that all these African countries got their independence at the same time? Yes, the colonial powers all decided to get lost at the same time, but it also because there was a network, a pan-African network of sisters and brothers, unfortunately mostly men as the leaders, reflecting the history of the time, but of people who were prepared, Kaunda and Nkrumah, Nyerere, Kenyatta, Haile Selassie, people who were prepared to form allegiances and create those networks. And there is an enormous thing about social capital that is incredibly important for us as leaders to foster, the capital of each of our staff in our own networks. So obviously there's a piece around the particular characteristic networks in our trusts, but also the networks that we create and how they support mutually the whole thing to work, in an organic way. Fundamentally, I hope I have not things you already know about. The intention wasn't to preach, although I'm aware that I'm slightly preachy in character. And the idea was to try and encourage principles that we know apply to leadership space, and then trying to sort of vaguely personalize that around the EDI agenda in terms of being inclusive. Please disagree with me and ask me any and all questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Emmanuel. A fantastic presentation and a real emphasis on inclusive leadership actions and behaviours. And just I know you've got about 10 minutes to help, and yeah, I know you do need to dash off as well, and you'll be coming back to us. But just as some questions are coming through onto the chat. One of the questions I'd like to pose to you is around the connection between inclusive leadership and accountability. So for me, the RES has been absolutely fantastic in highlighting the data, and I personally adopted ethnographic methodologies to improve race equality performance. What we find within the NHS nationally are, for race, disability, and LGBT plus people, the experience of bullying, harassment, discrimination, and equal opportunities in career development and progression is the worst compared to the wider workforce. So whilst the inclusive leadership is important, my question to you is, what does accountability look like to address and enhance our performance on EDI under these key areas?
No, good challenge, Ricky. Please call me Anton as well, please. The thing I would say is, fundamentally, my problem with the RES, the reason I didn't want to join the national team, I had to be persuaded, was because I felt myself, okay, 6 years ago, the RES reflected something wider than my own lived experience. Okay, it's useful. But 6 years down the road, I'm not clear what we've changed, if I'm really this whole thing about marginal gains. It's hard to feel that that's of any use. And then you see what happened with COVID and the disproportionate impact it had on our people. You think, well, yeah, marginal gains be damned. I actually want something more than marginal gains. So I think the problem has been that we've never translated that into having KPIs. So the CQC have never engaged with this data set. They come along and it's a gut punch to each and every BME person in an organization which gets outstanding as well led when its res data is crap. How do they square that? And more importantly, from my perspective, how do I get into the room with CQC to have that discussion with them? I can look at their 26 outstanding organizations and see that 16 of them are in the lowest 2 deciles of the res data. So that kind of chart I showed you earlier on, the orange and blue chart, we can do that for all the metrics and so you can say almost the worse you do your res, the more likely you are to be outstanding. That can't be right. So how do we get into that space? So I think the thing for me is twofold. Number one, to get CQC to buy in and to say, look, can we use some of the lived experience and do that? Secondly, to remind them of the data that staff experience and patient experience are intimately connected. These aren't 2 optional extras. And again, to that whole Sunday Telegraph nonsense that we're all trying to preach racial justice, and it's not what the NHS has time for. Staff outcomes and patient outcomes are intimately linked. The better your res data, guess what? The more likely your staff are to take up COVID and flu vaccine. Not just BME staff, but all staff. In other words, if you do EDI stuff well, you do everything else well as an organization. The less patient safety adverse event reports come up, the better your finances. So res matters. So to try and get into that space, that how do they make their judgments? How do we help influence that? And then how do we remind them that staff well-being and patient well-being, which is what they're mostly focused on, are intimately connected? That's the CQC piece we're doing. And then the other piece we're doing is to produce a strategy which is built around KPIs. So the strategy, as will be launched in Black History Month, is going to essentially have that thing at each level. So at system level, at organization level, at HROD level, at primary care, the recommended actions that are possible within our legal duty and permissions, and within our ambition, and then each of those attached to a KPI, so that I think that's how you essentially take this stuff. A very long answer to a very simple question. From being just from just inclusive to actually being accountable.
Thank you, Anton, and that's really pleasing to hear. My organisation has very recently just had a CQC inspection, and for the first time, I felt there were very strong emphasis and questioning and analysis of our equality and diversity performance. So steps are moving in the right direction. And just wanted to quickly share, just to inspire some of our colleagues here today. Change can happen. I've in my own organisation, the Isle of Wight, from 2019 to 2020. We improved the experience of career development and progression under our RES metrics, race equality metrics, by 32%. So we went from 52% to 83%, and just within 12 months. And the experience of discrimination was also reduced by 50% as well. But interestingly, Anton, as you mentioned, COVID has actually deteriorated the experience, so enhanced bullying, harassment, discrimination. So we have seen a slight decline in terms of our improvement trajectory. So ultimately, I do recommend the ethnographic methodologies to kind of live in the shoes of our people, to have that kind of experiential data. But the res, and for any colleagues from the private sector here today as well, the Workforce Race Equality Standard on the NHS-EI website is a fantastic information there. Just one final question, if that's okay, from one of our delegates. Looking at the categories, this is a really good question, looking at the categories of ethnic minority people and the differentiation, because I've certainly found Black British people were overrepresented in disciplinary, informal and formal disciplinary proceedings in the organisations I've worked in previously. So is there any work going on in regards to those specific ethnic categories and looking at any differential experiences?
Yeah, no, thanks, Roya, for the question. Really, really important, and thanks for giving me a chance to ride the hobby horse of the res a tiny bit. So, yeah, definitely this year's two or three very big changes for the res reporting this year. The stuff we all submitted a couple of weeks ago is now just being cleaned and then analysed. And going forward, each organisation is going to get its own regional or trust level detailed report, and the national report that comes out is going to be much more of a kind of a best of medley, like an album, rather than a detail in the way it was before. And the point being that we're going to produce data so at local level, so people can get their teeth into it, back to that kind of accountability piece. You can't say, oh, well, it's a big picture. Here's your local data. We're going to present it split by gender so that we can see the differential experience that in particular Black women seem to sustain, but across the piece, generally by gender. We're going to break it down by ethnicities. So there's going to be the experience of Black African, Black Caribbean, Southeast Asian, Filipino. Try and break that down a bit. Not to split communities, but just to help organizations identify where they can take accountable action. And we're also going to split the white thing. At the moment, white covers everything, which is not dark-skinned. So white other, the white Gypsy and traveller community, white Europeans who we know also from the medical res have a particular proportion. So we're going to try and break it down by ethnicity so that individual organizations can see where to get their teeth into. And the final thing, if I can just finish off the res things, that we launched the medical res July, and then we're just beginning, well, we will start the data collection, fingers and toes crossed, for a bank staff res. This is 250,000 people who we don't currently account for, mostly female, mostly BME, slightly older population, lots of particular characteristics. We need to understand their experience a little bit better. So trying to broaden the horizon of what we look at as res, but also trying to give it in a more granular detail.
Thank you so much, Professor Emmanuel. Great insights as usual, and thank you for everything you and your team are doing to drive that culture change right across the NHS with a data and evidence-based approach, but also reminding us around about accountability and transformation as part of culture, and recognizing those interlinks between patient care, patient experience, and customer outcomes to supporting a diverse and inclusive workforce through leadership as well. So absolutely fantastic insights. And just a quick note before I let you go around a message from Leslie. Welcome, Leslie. Great to see you again. Around looking at the nuances between inclusion and exclusion, and I think what Leslie's trying to say, looking at the culture change through transformation, looking at data, and any final thoughts and comments quickly in regards to that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. I think the fact of thinking about this in that framing of sort of inclusion and what we can do as leaders to include, rather than feeling it's all constant stick to be beaten with. And I think fundamentally, if we think about that and how, if people remove the whole thing about tokenism and just expecting people to just come in and assimilate. So I think for me, that's exactly the point. Inclusion done properly is the most powerful thing. And that's when you see organizations really make transformational change. So I probably feel like I've belittled the idea of culture change a bit, which I didn't intend to necessarily, but it's more that it's not just saying culture change, it's actually doing stuff, which is about inclusion essentially. So yeah, that's the one line take home.
Fantastic. Professor Emmanuel, thank you so much. It's an absolute pleasure to see you again, and looking forward to catching up with you soon. And thank you to everyone for your questions. Really appreciate your fantastic presentation there. Excellent stuff.
Don't forget the MRes webinar tomorrow if anyone's free for it.
Fantastic. Brilliant plug there for the webinar tomorrow as well. Thank you, Professor Emmanuel. Great stuff.